Hi, this is Dr. Victoria Skirbo speaking to you from the Seeds of Transformation Healing Center in Wareham, Massachusetts. And I was debating about what to speak to next about 2017. This is my third video on 2017. And if you have missed my other two, the first one is titled, I believe, 10-1, the Universal Year 2017. And the second one is astrological aspects 2017, the cardinal t-square. And what I would like to do is I'd like to break down that cardinal t-square a little bit further into its component parts. And t-squares are when we have at least 3 planets in a stressful aspects to each other. Aspects are geometrical relationships, and there is always an opposition within the t-square and a third planet squaring both ends of that opposition. And so it's sort of where you have say 2 planets in opposition to each other, and then a third planet squaring that, which this would be the third planet. And in the case of this particular t-square, we have Pluto being the planet squaring both ends of the opposition, and the opposition being between Uranus and Jupiter. Now, the opposition is what I want to speak of first. And the opposition between Uranus and Jupiter actually is part of a, I believe, 14-year cycle of expansion of consciousness. I think it might be 13 years. 13-year synodic cycle. What's a synodic cycle? A synodic cycle is actually the time it takes for 2 planets to go from conjunction to conjunction. And so at some point 2 planets can be together at the same degree, and then the synodic cycle occurs, and then we again come back to where the 2 planets are at the same degree. Certain synodic cycles are longer than others. If we look at the lunation cycle between the sun and the moon, that synodic cycle is 29 days long. But if we look at larger cycles such as Saturn and Neptune, that's a 36-year cycle. If we look at between Pluto and Uranus, that can be anywhere from, I think, 113 to 145-year cycle. And so these cycles are bigger or smaller depending on how far these planets are from each other. Now, Jupiter has a 12-year cycle around the sun, and so when Jupiter is in a synodic cycle with an outer planet, it's going to be around 12 years. In the case of the Uranus, it's 13 years. And so this cycle actually began back in 2010. And we had a conjunction between Uranus and Jupiter in 2010. We actually had 2 conjunctions in 2010 and 1 conjunction in 2011. Because Uranus is so far out, we had a retrograde gradation. And so we had one while Uranus was direct, retrograde, and then direct again. So we have 3 hits, so to speak, to the beginning of this cycle. And the first hit occurred on June 8th of 2010, and it occurred at 1 degree of Aries. Now, what makes that specifically important is that 1 degree of Aries is the beginning of the tropical zodiac. It's called the Aries point. So anything at the Aries point is very, very powerful. And we have Uranus, the sudden out of nowhere change, and Jupiter, which is expansion. Both in Aries, the sign of the warrior, the sign of becoming, the sign of war, really, one of the aspects of Aries. And so we had a birth at that point. Now, the next 2 conjunctions that occurred in this cycle actually occurred in Pisces, because what happened is Uranus retrograded back into Pisces and so did Jupiter. They both retrograded back into Pisces. So we have the next two conjunctions both in Pisces, and the second one was September 19th of 2010, and that occurred at 29 degrees of Pisces, so almost at the very, very end of Pisces. And then on January 4th, 2011, we had one at 27 degrees of Pisces, and then they moved past the conjunction. So that was the beginning of the cycle, this 14-year cycle, which has to do with the expansion of our consciousness. Okay, this is our awakening, people. So, wherever you have 1 degree, 29 degrees, and 27 degrees of Aries and Pisces in your chart is where this seed of consciousness, or the expansion of consciousness, was planted. So you have to look at your own personal chart. If you would like to get a personal chart, you could go to astro.com, and you put your day, time, and place of birth, and you can get a free chart. If you would like that chart evaluated by an astrologer such as me, you can call me at Vicki at theseedsoftransformation.com. Just drop me an email, and we can talk about looking at your chart. Now, that was back 2010, 2011. Well, it's 2016 now, and just about ready to be 2017. And what has happened is that this cycle has come to its halfway point. Now, when we look at cycles here, okay, here we have the beginning of the cycle. Uranus conjunct Jupiter. This is when the seed is planted. Now what happens is both planets continue to move in the sky, but the faster moving planet, which in this case is Jupiter, starts moving away from Uranus. And back in 2013 and 2014, we had the first square of these two planets. Squares are crisis points. And so we had a crisis in action at that point. We needed to take an action on the seeds planted back in 2010 and 2011. And so from 2013 to 2014, we started to move forward, taking actions, building the foundations for whatever seed was planted, seed of consciousness was planted back in 2010 and 2011. And the squares for these two planets, now Uranus was still in Aries and Jupiter was in Cancer at that time. And so these squares occurred August 21st, 2013, February 26th, 2014, and April 20th, 2014. I don't know if anybody remembers April of 2014, but we had a grand cardinal cross in the sky right around that 20th day of April, give or take either side of that day. It was a really intense period. You can look back in your life and kind of come to some understanding of why it was so intense. And there was this real sense at that time to push, almost like we were pushing a baby out, and that baby was us. I am back, pushing out the baby. And so now we come to the halfway point of this cycle. And opposition, so we have an opposition between Uranus and Jupiter. Uranus is still in Aries, Jupiter now is in Libra. And so we have an awareness around our need to be uniquely who we are, Uranus and Aries, opposing or in opposition to Jupiter, which is expansion, in Libra, which is about dialogue, partnership, relationship, and listening. And so it is time for us to start to dialogue with each other and listen to each other. Okay? And really come to awareness of self and others and how those things are interconnected and how they manifest in our lives. And so wherever you have Aries and Libra in your chart, in your natal chart, you're going to see something come to fruition. An opening comes up. Okay? There's like suddenly there's a superhighway where there wasn't a superhighway before. And you can go back and forth between the Aries energy and the Libra energy and really come to an understanding of who you uniquely are and how you can bring that to your relationships, and then dialogue and listen in your relationships, and then bring that back to who you are and see how you can come to a point of balance and understanding and awareness. Okay? Now that by itself is kind of, well, nothing is calm with Uranus. I was going to say calm, but that's not true. There's no calmness with Uranus. But that would just be a point of awareness. But because we have the t-square and we have Pluto making a conjunction, making a square to both ends of these opposition, then we have a driving force. Squares bring energy and drive, and we have Pluto in Capricorn. Pluto is transformation, death and rebirth, power. And Capricorn is power and the structure of our reality and the structure of our political and governmental and large institutional systems. There's a lot of rebellion. Anytime you have Uranus in the picture, we're dealing with rebellion. So we are awake now, and we are seeing things. Now, I'm going to talk about the other parts of this T-square as well. I just want to talk about the point of awareness first, and this is the point of awareness. Next, I'll be talking about Pluto and how Pluto interacts with either side of this opposition, and then we'll put it all together. I'll be right back. Hi, back. Now, so the other part of this T-square that I want to talk about are the squares, and Pluto makes a square to Uranus. Now, I'm sure many people who follow astrology have heard a lot about this Pluto-Uranus square. The Pluto-Uranus square was actually active between 2012 and 2015, where it made 7 exact squares to each other. And this is part of a cycle that began back in 1965 and 1966. At that time, Pluto and Uranus made a conjunction in Virgo. It actually made 3 conjunctions, all in Virgo. I think 1 in 65 and 2 in 66, or 2 in 65 and 1 in 66. But at that time, these 2 transpersonal planets, which the transpersonal planets deal with great cultural shifts, made their conjunction. And if we look at the 60s, at least from my perspective as somebody living in the United States, which is, the perspective I have, I'm not a studier of world events necessarily. Know a couple, but I really only have the perspective of growing up in America at that time. And so there was great upheaval, and there was a great shift from the beginning of the 60s to the end of the 60s, and that shift really was in part due to that Pluto-Uranus square. It sort of changed everything. And everything that was seated at that time, things like women's rights, the ecology movement, natural health, marijuana, legalization, buying on credit, and the civil rights movement, all of those things sort of, although the civil rights movement definitely predates the 60s, but it really came to a head at that time. And so there was this transformational energy, and then it sort of went underground for quite a while. And some people may have thought that a lot of those ideas that came up at that time were dead. But what in fact was happening is that they were growing a root system. And so 50 years later, in 2012, we have the beginning of this Pluto-Uranus square. And this is what has really driven the evolutionary and cultural bus. And so we have been going through these transformations. The squares occurred in the signs of Pluto in Capricorn and Uranus in Aries, which are cardinal. And as I said in the last video, cardinal is really about initiation, starting something new. And so we are leveling up, really, And so this particular square that we have is a 90-degree square, which is a crisis in action. And so now we feel the need to take an action. And we have seen things rise up, fall down, rise up, fall down. And this process is really the beginning of the shift and the beginning of the change. And when we get into the phase of the first quarter square, the crisis in action, it's really about working on building the foundations of those things built in, as planted back in the 60s. And so the idea was planted in the 60s, but now it's time for us to put our back in it and work it. And so this particular part of the square, of the cardinal t-square that's going on right now, has really been there the whole time since 2010. You know, it's just the where what was in Libra and then temporarily in Cancer, you know, planets in those points on the square. But Pluto and Uranus really is the engine or the backbeat, and it is still happening, even though it's no longer exact. Now Uranus is moving forward past the exact square. But we will feel the energy and we feel the revolution, and there are certain astrologers who believe that the orb for this is 15 degrees, meaning within 15 degrees of exactitude we're going to feel the square. And so we're looking way into like 2020, 21, 22. So we will still be feeling this, and this is part of the square. So we have the awareness around the in the opposition concerning our consciousness, the expansion of our consciousness, you and I, me and you, dialogue, relationship, new beginnings, right? How we're going to relate in a whole new, totally new way. That's the opposition. And then we have Pluto making that square to Uranus, which is part of the opposition. And then Pluto is also making a square to Jupiter. Now this cycle began back in 2007. At that time, Pluto and Jupiter made a conjunction. I believe they made 3 conjunctions, all in the latter degrees of Sagittarius. And so, and it was at the very end. So actually, was it 3 times? No, it wasn't 3 times. It was once. It was December 11th, 2007. And it made a conjunction. I believe it was the 30 degrees of Sagittarius. So what's interesting about that is that Pluto had been in Sagittarius 12, 13 years at that point. So it was right at the end. And then Jupiter, which is the ruling planet of Sagittarius, had been in Sagittarius for a year. So there was a lot of Sagittarius energy. And so something was planted at that time. Well, that seed has moved, and it has moved to 3/4 of the way around the cycle. Okay? And so we have a crisis in consciousness when it comes to Jupiter and Pluto. Pluto is power, and Jupiter is, in Libra especially, is about expansion of, it's a real, it's a test of what we believe about our society and our place in our society, and whether or not we can really trust those people in power, you know. And this is there's a lot of legal ramifications here. So we can see even in the outer world how long-held legal priorities are shifting and changing and being changed. And I have to say, I dread the thought of who Donald Trump is going to make, who's going to pick as a Supreme Court justice. It does not look good for us, honestly. But okay, we're not going to go there because I can't. And so we have these squares. So we have a crisis in action square that is pushing our evolution and requiring us to take actions on the seeds planted back in the 60s. That's why a lot of the energy that we're seeing now seems familiar. I mean, you see all these people protesting, and a lot of the young people are protesting it almost feels like it's the 60s again, you know? And so that hasn't died. That is coming up, and it's coming up to really, so we can really make something with this. This is life or death, really, on every level. And so this is part of the t-square that we are going to experience in 2017 on that 1 year. So we do have a lot of awareness, and because we have Pluto squaring our awareness, then those people in power are going to be kind of at cross purposes with us. And so this is a revolutionary change, and this is part of the reason we're going to see such huge revolutionary shifts in 17. I think next time I will actually, just as I promised the time before this, I will talk about Eris and Uranus in Aries trine Saturn in Sagittarius. Okay. It's great talking to you. If you enjoy this video, please press the like button. If you would like a reading with me, I can be reached at Vicki, V-I-C-K-I, at theseedsoftranceformation.com. I hope I hope you find this helpful and useful, and share it if you would. Thanks. Have a great day.